Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out to join us today for our first webinar of the year. My name is Dr. Tashina Reeder. I am the Director of the Community Health Training Alliance, and today I'm excited to kick off our Black History Month that we're paying homage to bell hooks. And today is our first webinar of many speaking to who Bell Hooks was and her work around Black masculinity. And with us, we have Tiara Neal, who will be our presenter for today. And so I am excited, hi Tiara, to have you with us today to do this presentation on who is Bell Hooks. But before we get started, there are a few things I would like to tell you all who are in attendance. One, your chat box has been disabled. However, you can ask any of your questions or have any comments in the Q&A box, which is below your screen below. At the time of instruction, if I'm asked to open up the chat for you all to participate in an activity that may be provided during this webinar, I will then open up the chat. Please feel free to ask questions and all of that. We want to hear from you at the end of the presentation. And so at that time, when you post your questions, I will ask them at the end of this webinar for Tiara to answer all those things that you may have inquired of. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tiara, play a short video first, and then you will hear from our presenter.
The influential critic, author, and feminist Bell Hooks died today at the age of 69. She was at home surrounded by friends and family. Amna is back with a look at her work and her legacy.
Born Gloria Jean Watkins, Bell Hooks grew up in segregated Kentucky in the 1950s and 60s. The daughter of a janitor and a maid, Hooks left home to attend Stanford University, where she earned an English degree. She went on to earn a PhD and then authored more than 30 works under her pen name, which was taken from her great-grandmother. Her prolific writing spanned poetry, essays, and children's books, examining the intersection of race, politics, and gender, and making her one of the most influential Black feminist scholars of the last half century. In 2004, Hooks returned to Kentucky to teach at Berea College and later founded the Bell Hooks Institute there. Here to talk more about her life and its impact is Imani Perry. She's the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Perry, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
You reacted to the passing of Bell Hooks on Twitter by sharing this thought. You wrote, "For exactly 30 years, she was not only an intellectual influence, but a presence in my life." Professor Perry, tell us about the impact that Bell Hooks had on you.
Well, I met her when I was 19 years old. I was an intern at South End Press, where she published much of her work, and she was a teacher to her core, even though I didn't have her in the classroom. She brought ideas alive. She is a person who bridged the space between, high critical theory, European scholars and intellectuals, Marxist thinkers, and everyday life. And she wrote and spoke in a way to make all of that theory applicable to our daily lives. And also, she wanted it to bear upon the way we thought of each other ethically. our relationships, our personal stories. So she was both an intellectual, and she was also a kind of, I don't know, a curate, like a person who tended to souls as an educator. And so to be brought under her wing as a teenager was incredibly influential. It allowed me to imagine how to live a life of the mind, but also how to pursue, right relation to other human beings in my midst.
So as we mentioned, she was born Gloria Jean Watkins. She took the pen name Bell Hooks, which was her great-grandmother's name. What do we know about why she took that name, and why all lowercase when she used it?
Yeah, I mean, it was consistent with leftist organizers of the era to think of the individual in the lowercase, that one spoke in the collective, right? So her name was both an homage to her great-grandmother and the women who came before, but also was a kind of humility to choose the lowercase. And she was very much, she traveled the world. She had a massive influence. She was a Southern country woman to her core. And she'd never lost touch with that, and so there was a kind of intimacy with that identity that she held on to through her pen name, as it were. But I always called her Gloria.
And she mentioned those Southern roots, growing up at the intersection of racism and sexism. She actually spoke about it in this 2016 talk at St. Norbert College in Wisconsin. Take a listen to what she said.
I think that many of us as females find sexism is so normalized, whereas people of color, Black, brown, whatever, when we hear a racist joke or racism spoken not as a joke, we really feel assaulted in our sensibilities. But sexism is such a woven into the fabric of our daily lives that I think it's harder for people to resist.
Professor Perry, how did that lived experience show up in her work?
Well, she told a lot of stories from her own life. She in many ways was an open book. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, and she contemplated. So the way that she engaged with people, and she was outspoken, and she could be really challenging, was to open that up, to explore those questions of internalized sexism, internalized classism. How do we love each other? So that kind of exploration that was consistent with who she was. And for me, it allowed me to think all of the sort of academic things I was pursuing, they boiled down to the very core about how we are going to live and how we're going to coexist on this planet, right? That's who she was.
It has been 4 decades since her first full-length book, Ain't I a Woman, was published. And you have to note that a lot of the ideas she brought up back then about Black women and feminism and white feminism and the intersection of race and sex and all of these things, we're still talking about those things and grappling with them today. What do you think the legacy of those ideas that she raised 4 decades ago is today?
Well, I think her legacy is enormous, and part of this incredible body of work that she created. The legacy that's found is there's so many young people. The first time they start to think seriously about class, about sexuality, about gender, about identity, about vulnerability, about spirituality is through her work. Her work has never gone out of press. That Ain't I a Woman you can still purchase, right? And so the legacy is actually in all of us who have been influenced by her work, not just in academia, in every sector of the society, in organizing and nonprofit worlds and corporate America. And so, it really she has shaped several generations of thinkers and of people who are members of community.
So I think that is where they stop and I begin. So I say to you, good morning, good morning, good morning. Thank you for joining me in partnership with Community Health Training Alliance through a program of Philadelphia Fight. My name is Tiara Neal, and I just want to say, first of all, thank you for joining us this morning to talk about the life and legacy of Bell Hooks. And then I cannot go on without saying thank you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Tashina Reeder, who has been an influencer in my life in so many different ways, just a fantastic model to the community. And I honor you. Thank you so very much for inviting me into this space. So this morning, before I get into what Bell Hooks means to me and her work around Black masculinity, I just want to share with you who I am and how I came to partner in this work around Black masculinity. I'm going to be very transparent. This is an opportunity for me to be vulnerable and anecdotal as well as educational in this format. And I'm excited to be able to do that. And I invite you in this journey to do the same. As we interact and engage with some of what I'll share this morning, I ask you to be as introspective as possible. Introspection helps us to be introspective, meaning that how we go inward, how we assess ourselves, helps us to build better relationship with community, with others in community. And I know that this format of this digital life that we've been living has been very trying for a lot of us, sending some of us into spaces of depression and sadness and all sorts of ways that we have not been built for. We were created for relationship. We were created for community, and we were created for connection. So I invite you to get as comfortable as possible. I know for me as a thinker, and as a scholar, I do my best thinking and scholarship in places that feel very comfortable to me, whether it's out in nature, whether it's on my couch, on the floor with my legs folded, whatever it is, we're going to do that today. And so grab your coffee. I have mine. My mug says, I love you, because I do. And your water, whatever it is that you're drinking, and join along, jot your questions down. You can use the chat feature or Q&A feature. I do believe that there's some disclaimer there about that. I'm just going to share my screen and just talk a little bit about, let me start with who I am. I am the daughter of Robert and Renee Neal, who are both Black Americans in this country. My father was a victim to drug abuse, addiction, incarceration, and all manners of things, but he did not start that way. My mother was a working class, turned single mom in my high school years, and forced me to become hyper educated as a result of my own hypervigilance to heal the ill in my own family. And I'll share a little bit about what those relationships have meant to me. I am the sibling to one brother and 5 adopted brothers. What does that mean? That means that I created a community of men that I love, not all Black, one trans individual, one El Salvadorian individual, and then the rest are Black men. And that gives you context a little bit to who I am. Just because I think it's important that I emphasize that I am a healer to men. And I would not consider myself a feminist, although some of my friends say I am. That is defined however your perception accepts it or receives it. But I will say that it qualifies me to exist in space as a healer. I do name myself a healer. And a collectivist. As you have seen in my bio, I also call myself a soulpreneur. And what does that mean? That means that I create works and I encourage people to create works from the healing part of themselves, from their purpose. And I won't get into all of that, but I am a thinker, but I'm a lover first. I consider myself a God person, a Jesus person, so to speak. I hope that does not disqualify me, because I am an interfaith lover. And I consider myself an influencer to various aspects of generational diversity. By way of my occupation, I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion executive and adjunct professor, where I teach social justice from a social work framework, as well as social wellness and multidimensional wellness. That is going to bleed into what I share. Some of what I share will be anecdotal, and some of what I share will just be pure engagement from the aspects of Bell Hooks's work that I found very interesting. Now, I will tell you that a lot of folks don't know who Bell Hooks is, just because I perceive from various aspects, she was either too right for some or too left for others. And that word too, TOO, sometimes forces us in a place where not everybody is going to accept what we have to share, right? So with that said, I am a person who may share something with you that you may not agree with, and I'm okay with that, because that challenge, that grappling helps us to influence individuals to think about their own position in life. It's not always wrong. In fact, it's not wrong, period, to disagree, as long as we do so respectfully. So I will say also that my presentation to you may come from a heteronormative positionality. There may be individuals in this space who are same gender loving, who are trans individuals. Whatever your position is in this space, I invite you to take language, to take ideology, to take challenges and apply it to your own context. And in doing so, when you discover who you really are, you will be able to share that with someone else to the point where you become an advocate of self and then an advocate of others. And that's how we create self-agency. That's how we create agency for other people. And without further ado, I'm just going to get into my content this morning. So give me one moment as I share my screen with you all. And if you see any typos, I'm a human being with a lot of things that I do. So please give me grace and forgive me. Ooh, let's stop that. I don't want to share that. Let's try this again. 1 second, everyone. I apologize. All right. Here we go. So again, and if it helps you, you can type your questions in the chat section, or I'm sorry, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll leave an opportunity at the end of this session to answer some of those questions. All right. So I use this opportunity, of course, as an educator and as a healer to create an advisory or some sort of space to share that some of the concepts that have been presented by Bell Hooks are strong. They're strong criticisms around the ills of society. Bell Hooks was known as an influencer that shifted socio-political norms by challenging constructs that we've come to know. And so I do warn you that some of the things shared, even language, may be will invoke a visceral response where your body will begin to feel as if you are angered or triggered or sad. And I want you to take that moment to stop and to breathe, to reflect on, or maybe even jot some words down if you begin to feel like you're grinding your teeth, or you feel this inclination to disengage. I will say that if you're able to stay connected, because in doing so and staying connected, you'll be able to respond to what's happening inwardly and why. This is a part of what it means to be a critical thinker. I think sometimes we come to the table feeling like we have to be politically correct all the time, and nothing changes, right? Because we want the clouds, the cushions, and the softness. That's a part of our inward hedonistic desire to protect, right? But in protecting, sometimes we don't challenge the norms that we've set up in place and we've been socialized to do. So I will invite you that if you hear or see something that invokes a response that is, that feels negative, to stop, to breathe, and to think about why. And then to know that the intent of my presentation is only to highlight the scholarship and work and activism of Bell Hooks. And my intent may not create an impact that is positive. So my intent is good. Please assume the best intentions. My impact may shift into a negative form. So be aware of that and take care of yourself always. So Hooks as a feminist. So I just want to share that Hooks kind of took a very, she took a very outspoken perspective. And it's funny that she is defined as a feminist because feminism is often seen as this exclusion of men or a radical lean into anger or rage towards men in general. Whereas militant feminism kind of takes on the permission to unleash rage towards men and to talk about what men have done in a patriarchal format, and how to resist loving men or to create punitive connection to the things that men have implemented as a form of patriarchy. But Hooks, as a Black feminist, took a less than popular perspective as a contemporary feminist. She included men in her commentary, and she also held women accountable for their own part in patriarchy and sexism. And she included men as precious victims and as privileged oppressors. And so when you think about both to look at women or to blame women as sexist and patriarchal, as well as to include men in dialogue as both precious victims as well as oppressors, means that the entire community is accountable for how we interact with each other. And in the context of men and women, this is very traditional, again, very heteronormative. And I do apologize to those who are trans in this community, but I will also venture to say that Hooks has a lot of strong commentary about the shifts in positionality between how femininity and masculinity derive. And if you look at some of her work, this is interwoven into all of her work. And I don't want to get into the weeds of all of this. I just want to, at a high level, kind of share with you some of Hooks's context, just because it helps us to understand why she states certain things. Again, she authored close to 50 works. The interview said 30, but it was, she had works around education as well. My engagement and interaction with Hooks started in my PhD program. Actually, it started because I attended an HBCU in the 90s, and then really got a chance to interact with her works in my PhD program. And she has this phenomenal work called Teaching to Transgress. And throughout that work is interwoven some of her experiences as an educator. If we have any educators in that space, I invite you to take a look at that, and to also note that some of her work as an educator was influenced by Paulo Freire. And if you know anything about Freire, he's all about teaching from the standpoint of not repeating what your educators teach you, but to create a space of innovation and critical thinking beyond what we're socialized to think. So it's not regurgitation of information, but more so that educators should teach from the aspect of gleaning from work to create greater work. And that we don't do enough of that in our own society. But I digress. Let me get back to our point about Black masculinity. So Bell's work pretty much approaches exploration from what I can see, these particular areas of intersection, and there of course are a ton more, but she uses narrative shaping, and through all of her work, every bit of work that I've engaged with, she shares tons of stories about her own experiences in the world, right? She shares experiences about what's happened to her, how she's shown up, how she's engaged in conversation with others, and does this wonderful job of sharing other people's stories in a way that frame the why and how to be in relationship with other people. Bell was also a truth teller. And so you hear her in some of her interviews, and I'll share one where she uses very salacious language. You know, she uses words that we tend to shy away from to normalize things that we make a secret. I mean, from the aspects of engaging with Bell's work, her exploration says that the things that we hide and keep a secret cannot be healed. We hear this all the time with quotes. that say like what you don't deal with, you can't heal, things of that nature. So Belle takes a very truth-telling approach to what she sees. Now we know that truth sometimes is based on perception, right? And in the society that we're in, folk will say things like my own truth, right? But there is some absolute truth in the world. Absolute truth meaning Black men are gunned down at a higher rate. Truth meaning that there are neighborhoods that are gentrified based on capital. The truth meaning that there are high rates of incarceration and imprisonment for communities of color. However, truth also means I feel. And sometimes I feel is based on what I see or what I experience that may be clouded by judgment and things of that nature that are subjective to the individual that expresses that, right? So Belle does an amazing job with interacting with the I feels versus the facts, right? By bringing out what the facts are and how they impact people who are perceived to be vulnerable in our population. She also takes a high critical thinking approach by asking questions of the who, the what, the why, what's involved. And she does this so brilliantly. I love the way Imani Perry kind of introduced her in the beginning by saying that, she was an intellectual that not just bared upon her thought, but engaged in what it meant to be in relationship and grappling with what it means to be an American, right? What it means to be a global citizen and how all of that impacts individuals in a challenging space where we have patriarchy, right? Where we have imperialism, where we have white supremacy, and unpacking what all of that means. Belle also makes tons of cultural references to pop culture. And she shares that, pop culture is the impetus that really drives marginalized communities, whereas communities that are of dominance may be driven by government relations or engagement to certain parts of mainstream society. When it comes to the marginalized or those that rest on the sidelines, pop culture is the thing that really speaks for the marginalized if we pay close attention. And then she has conversations of radical kind where she's not afraid to tell people, that they're wrong or that what they're saying is bullshit, right? And, she uses terms like bullshit very often. And she's just not afraid to say, what she thinks. And then she has very framed language around her scholarship that I think has not yet been grounded, has not been accepted as a form of scholarship. And I think this is very important because I think she gets at the points of colonization and decolonization from the perspective of we're not just addressing, these cliche terms of racism or sexism, but that all of these things are interconnected for a reason. And so you'll hear her use terminology like imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchy in one word. That is one word to Belle, right? That's really, really heavy. Imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchy. And she just lets it roll off her tongue like this poetry. And she is a poet, but for me, like at this moment, as I'm engaging with this word that I've been reading over and over and over again, I get chills, right? Because it's not just we're talking about racism, we're talking about gender issues, we're talking about heteronormativity, we are talking about a larger system, a larger interlocking system of domination that defines our reality. And not just to have one thing be like, gender is the important issue or race is the important issue. But for me, she says, the issue or the use of that particular jargonistic phrase was a sort of shortcut way of saying all these things actually are functioning simultaneously at all times in our lives, right? And that whether we realize it or not, whether we've connected critical consciousness, whether our consciousness is aware or not, that imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy is always driving everything that we do, right? And some of us would be like, no, that's bullshit, but it's not. Think about your decisions to where you work, how you spend your money, how you've chosen your spouse, and some of us will be like, well, I make my own choices. But some of us have been pushed to radical positionality as a result of bucking against what we perceive to be a system, right? At some point in time, at all points in time, we are interacting with the system. And that's a lot to interact with internally, but I take this pretty seriously in that certain decisions that we make, right? I think, and I'll share this very anecdotally, as a Black woman, and this is where I get vulnerable, right? As a Black woman, I still have the internal conversation of how I'm going to show up at my corporate space versus how I show up as an educator, right? And they're two very different positions for me as a Black woman in a space, right? Because there's interlocking perceptions, and some people would be like, well, why do you give a fuck what people think, right? Some people will say things like that. However, it's not that simple, because then that's connected to how I eat. That's connected to what I receive in terms of compensation, how I'm perceived by a community that I present myself to, right? And so some people would be like, well, I'll just show up the way I am. Some people have the privilege to do that, but what do you give up as a result of you showing up every day in a certain space? I may not have the liberty to show up in my executive meeting with my hair wilding out, right? However, somebody else may take that liberty and be like, it's okay for me to risk that. I may lose social capital. I may lose intellectual capital or perceptions of my qualifications in this moment, but I'm okay with that, right? But for me, I'm asking myself the question, if I do, what does that mean? What do I give up, right? And that's a very vulnerable question I ask myself pretty consistently. But again, that's for me to grapple with and to present in my own community as to what this means to me and what it means to the context of where I come from. And I hope that makes sense to you. So some of the themes that I kind of pulled out of some of Belle's work today, I'll talk a little bit, just very at a high level. Black male violence, sexism, and patriarchy in the housing practice. Don't know if we'll get to that, but I do have a short clip for that. Decolonization, sexual violence, fetishizing, awakening conscious around sexism and patriarchy, and then defining love beyond control and domination. And for me, this last one, defining love beyond control and domination, one of the things that Belle talks about is what it means to love well. And I have been on this journey as a creator, as a content creator, as a healer, as I term myself. I have been on this journey of asking myself what it means to love well, what it means to love my community well. And this love well concept is beyond romantic interest. I think sometimes when we hear the word love, we go binary on it, right? We go, how do I love in a sexual relationship with a partner? Or how do I love when it comes to my family? But love goes beyond that, right? Love is the choice to embrace, to contribute to envelope, to share, to care. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm getting ahead of myself because that aspect of Belle's work makes me really, really excited. So I'm just going to do a little level setting in terms of how some of these terms are involved in Belle's work, just because as you are interacting with me in this space and you're having questions about what the hell does all of this mean and why is it important to me? This is going to be the defining precipice for how Belle positions this. So colonialism in this aspect is a term where there's a conqueror and ruler over another territory. It means exploiting the resource of the conquered person, place, or thing for the benefit of the conqueror. Imperialism means creating an empire, expanding into the neighboring place or person, and expanding its dominance far out. Imperialism in this way applies rules, policies, and administers power and governance to what has been conquered to enforce systems of continued control. Let's interact with that a little bit, just for a moment. Take a moment to think about that. In fact, if you might, I invite you to share some things in the Q&A section around how you can see imperialism and applications of rules and policies that really administer or reinforce power and control that's not beneficial. We see this every single day. We can identify it. And if you're a deep thinker, you may be able to shift to very nuanced examples of how you see imperialism show up. So in defining patriarchy, right? This is very important. One of the things that Bell shares around patriarchy is that patriarchy is a political social system that insists that males are inherently dominating, superior to everything and everyone deemed weak, especially females, and endowed with the right to dominate and rule over the weak and to maintain that dominance through various forms of psychological terrorism and violence. In other words, patriarchy is a social and political system that gives men privileges, which results from a socialization process that teaches people heterosexual men are superior to women and to all non-heterosexual men. Sexism is a consequence and a symptom of a society that practices patriarchy. In other words, it is a system where it allows men to maintain the privilege of dominance without even thinking about it, without even wincing at it. And to me, to say it is a socialized process means that every part of your existence is a perception, not even if you're conscious of it, that men are supposed to sit in a superior sense. Now, this is a very feminist perspective, but there's a ton of truth to that. And I see this play out in my work a lot in DE&I, where I'm expected to go into organizations, not just to challenge the data metrics that prove that white men hold positions of power, but to also identify where patriarchy is a part of the attitudes and the injustices and the ills of the environment, right? That is that this exists because I say so, right? That's the patriarchy. I set this in place and it must exist like that. And in my opinion, and you can quote me on this, that patriarchy is the antithesis of community. One of the things that Bell said, that Imani Perry said about Bell earlier, is that she took on bell hooks as lowercase as a form of humility, saying that I am a part of a collective whole. And she was actually called a communist for a long time, or that she held communist ideals. And I think if you're younger in this space, you may not be talking about things like that. And that also may invoke some visceral response in this space. But what that also says is that I am a part, I belong, right, to a community, and my community belongs to me. Patriarchy in and of itself says, I am owner of this. I own this. I'm the head of this. I am the one that dominates this. And my particular job is to continue to dominate. And if you perceive me as someone less than that, that it's my responsibility to then usurp your authority to take over control, right? And this is where that gets at this imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy attitude, right? This is all of these interlocking systems that say, at any point in time, I can dominate over your gender, your race, your age, your class, or whatever I need to position myself as the head of this. And that really, she talks about, comes from a place of fear. When it comes to Black masculinity, Bell has a ton of strong work out there. In fact, I will share some clips from a conversation that Bell has with Kevin Powell, where they're talking about reconstructing Black masculinity and defining what it means to be a Black male in this society, as well as redefining and unpacking some of the attitudes that are really connected to the roots of why Black men are perceived a certain way. And in this way, reconstructing Black masculinity from Bell's perspective is the idea that we can break life threatening chokehold patriarchal masculinity that we can, I'm sorry, let me reread that. Reconstructing Black masculinity is the idea that we can break the life-threatening chokehold patriarchal masculinity imposes on Black men and create life-sustaining visions of a reconstructed Black masculinity that can provide Black men ways to save their lives and to live the lives of their brothers and the lives of their brothers and sisters in struggle. Towards the work of political reunification of the genders in Black communities today, Black men must acknowledge and begin to confront the existence of sexism in Black liberation struggle as one of the chief obstacles impeding its advancements. That's a lot to unpack in and of itself. Black liberation struggle is one of the challenges that we continue to have. And I think if I might pause in this moment, as you also know, I am a theologian. I studied at the Palmer Theological Seminary and got my MDiv from there. Studied very little about what it meant to be a Black liberation theologist. And I believe next week, as we share with the male panel, we'll have a chance to engage with some of the guys who are connected to Black liberation theology. But the Black liberation struggle is one that has been paused, I will say, because the position of having strong opinions around sexism and how sexism is a tertiary or a side point to Black liberation is why we've paused. Within the connection of Black liberation, we must talk about the fact that there is male dominance and that it continues to get perpetuated a lot. I'm gonna say this, I don't know if there are ministers or reverends or theologians in the room, in what we know as the Black church or Black faith communities. The existence of sexism and the separation of the Black male existence and the Black woman existence in that space is paused. And guess what? Black folk belong to faith communities. If you look at the number, 80% of Black individuals are involved in some sort of faith community. And so these are where our ideals and our norms continue to get perpetuated. In fact, in our pulpits, if you see, there is still the strong existence of that male voice as senior leader, right? And this is where it's important that if you are a theologian in this space, that you take liberation thought, right? Black liberation thought and the struggle of sexism in this space and all kinds of isms in this space and continue to challenge this existent obstacle. I can't even talk. Existent obstacle that continues to get perpetuated. She goes on to say that making womanist space for Black men to participate in allied relation to feminist movement, to oppose the oppression of women means Black men going against the grain of the racist, sexist mythology of Black manhood and masculinity in the US. Its underlying premise is rooted in white supremacist patriarchal ideology and continues to foster the idea that we pose a racial and sexual threat to American society, such that our bodies exist to be feared, brutalized, imprisoned, annihilated, and made invisible. And we see this against this norm. And there's a lot in this when it comes, we could unpack this for hours, right? We could sit and unpack this for hours. But this last part of this, that we are posed as a threat to American society and that our bodies exist to be feared, brutalized, imprisoned, annihilated, and made invisible. That part right there, I believe has played out for a very long time. But I also say that the experiences and the civil unrest around George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, and all of the Breonna Taylor, all of these experiences have pushed us in the sense where we are, as a society, tired of this internalized, unconscious connection to fear and to the realization that Black bodies are brutalized and that Black bodies are perceived as unimportant, right? And there are people, there are industries, there are corporate spaces that are commodifying that. Let's be honest, right? There are spaces that are pandering this image of we're for diversity and inclusion, right? And I say this as a practitioner. I have a job and I'm grateful for it, a very high paying job that I'm thankful for as a result of this pushback. However, we need to deconstruct what this means as human beings, right? And we need to also unpack how our unconscious connection to this fear and fear mongering around Black masculinity drives us to the position where we don't love well, where we don't provide a space for Black men and Black women and others to interact with us in community, to have the notion that oppression is really still at the forefront of a lot of the things that we create, a lot of the things that we do, a lot of the ways that we interact in the world. I will say also to this point that our definitions of Black maleness really have been defined in an unconscious way. We will never admit this out loud. Some people will say that this doesn't exist or I'm not that way. But I would say, what does it mean? What does it mean to be violent? What does it mean to be angry? What does it mean to be disagreeable, aggressive, emotionally unexpressive, or unresponsive? What does it mean to speak harshly? What does it mean to not be peaceful? And what does it mean to be confined into one way of being without being able to express yourself freely as you are known, right? I watch very closely the men in my life as they step into spaces where they're not received well. And then I watch them step into the places where they're known and loved as they really are, and they show up very different. And I do a lot to share what that means to me and how I observe them, right? And I think it's important, if you are a nurturer or if you attempt to position yourself as a nurturer, whether you're male, female, non-binary, or however you identify, to ask yourself the question of, when I'm in space with Black men, how are they interacting with me? How are they fearful? Do they engage as they're fully known? Do they show themselves and display themselves in a way that feels like it's authentic to them? Or do they take on a position of inauthenticity, right? Do they take on a position of angst? Do you perceive their anxiety? Do you perceive them to be observant and protective? Do you see them in a space of peace, or do you see them in a space of rigidity where they feel as though they cannot show up as they are? And this is important, right? Just because one of the things, and you'll get to see this, I'm going to play this about 10 minutes of this clip. One of the things that Belle talks about is that her father was a very peaceful man. And because her father was a very peaceful man, the men around her father called her father a punk, called him a pussy, called him, all sorts of names, and did not like that her father was a peaceful man. But in her father, she perceives, and she doesn't say it in this clip, but describes her father as a somewhat feminist, in that he was able to observe his construct of Black maleness. And that's it's brilliant, because Belle was in her 60s or 70s, which meant that if her father took on that position, he would have been off the heels of slave era and a part of this this idea of civil disobedience, so to speak. He would have taken on this attitude that actually shaped the way that Belle thinks. So I want us to take a listen to a piece of this interview that that's being shared here. So I am going to give me one moment to shift over to this video.
Sisters and one brother. And the brother, the youngest, is the one who was always favored over all the girls, over the women, by my grandmother. Yeah, and out of all the children, he probably is by far, and I hate to say this publicly, I mean, it is the truth though, failure in so many different ways. Because I feel like we oftentimes enable this dysfunctional behavior amongst us as men, on the one hand, it's this extreme of trying to protect, but the other side, we're not really being prepared, to navigate this life.
But let's really talk about, we're not prepared. We have nothing in this culture that prepares young Black boys to love themselves. And I can't stand all the crap about little boys, be a man, you the man of the house. We are not interested in creating a healthy childhood for young Black boys.
Yeah.
And until we do, I've spent a lot of time asking myself, because people really wanted me to come out strong against police brutality. And I was asking myself constantly, is police brutality the number one problem for Black male life? And then one of the things I kept reading is that Black men are fast becoming the most illiterate group in our society. And I was thinking, wow, if you can't read or write by the time you're 10, you're on your way to prison or to death. There's nothing else open for you. There's also so much joy. Think about how much joy, Kevin, we've gotten from things we read. It's a whole form of awakening. What got me out of the abusive patriarchal context? Reading.
Same here. Yeah.
Critically thinking. But if we deny Black males that space, because remember again that Malcolm becomes a critical thinker in prison. Right. Before that, he's just a jive dude, running around, being sexually indiscriminate, using drugs, whatever, selling drugs. It's when he pauses and begins to critically examine himself and his life through the vehicle of Islam, but still, it's that moment.
That's right.
That he becomes Malcolm X.
It's interesting because I'm just going to say this, Belle. I feel, having been involved in all this Black male work for the last 25, 30 years, it's almost like big business to talk about the issue of Black men and Black boys. I know folks who have made a fortune, as consultants, as advisors with their nonprofits, with these various campaigns. It's almost a joke to me, particularly when I know, because I've been to pretty much all 50 states in this country, every major city. I go to these communities where these young brothers are, and all these campaigns and all these initiatives are not reaching the folks they claim that they're supposed to be reaching. And so there's this Black elite that we need to talk about, along with the white elite that exists, that basically is like a buffer to the power structure and the status quo. They don't really want to see us come up at all. It's actually big business to see us as dysfunctional as possible. I remember being at a conference in Florida a couple of years back where the person before me, you had all Black boys in the audience, and everything that this person said about the Black boys in the audience, I was like, these boys should just die now. They're just doomed. You know what I'm saying? And I just feel like, we need to y'all, all of us need to challenge this madness of, y'all know what I'm talking about. We don't have to say any names, this madness of caring about Black boys when we don't. And then the part you're talking about, I see these rites of passages programs. A lot of them are bogus. Don't tell me that I'm an African king. And, I've heard it all because I've been a part of these things, man. You know what I'm saying? My name has been Kevin Powell, Kevin X, Kwesi, Kajati. Come on, let's be real about it. But at the end of the day, none of those conversations I was having until I encountered Belle and Pearl Cleek and everyone else actually talked about redefining Black manhood.
Awesome. And it's interesting to me that if you read the book, Kevin does talk about his violence against Black women.
Yeah.
But when I met Kevin, he had, begun to deal with therapy, anger management. People would tell me, well, you shouldn't be promoting Kevin Powell because, he's been violent towards Black women. And when I would say, but he has tried to confront his violence and make a change, I was so struck by how that didn't make any difference. It was like, let's be down on Kevin Powell. And I thought, this is the craziness too, that when Black men try to change, we don't affirm that effort to change, to be different. We want to keep you where you were 20 years ago.
Let's be clear. What I talk about in the book happened in 1991. It's now 2015. It's 24 years later. I actually had a Black male in Brooklyn say to me, I'm never going to support any of your work because of what you've done in your past. And I said to him, you wouldn't even know what I did in my past if I didn't write about it and talk about it. He said, doesn't matter. Then I said, Bell, well, do you love Malcolm X? Yeah, man, Malcolm is the epitome of black manhood. You ain't no Malcolm X. I said, well, in the autobiography of Malcolm X, Malcolm smacked Sammy Pip's woman, and did all kinds of foul stuff to women. But he's your hero. And so I also feel like, we appreciate somebody that's dead, but we don't even want to see folks trying. Like, I believe in DJ Reborn. One of my sisters said to me once, unless someone is absolutely egregious in their behavior and is not making an effort at all, because what I remember, and it's ironic, I got to say this, it was Sam Anderson, an older black man who was the first head of diversity program here at the New School, Eugene Lane College, 24 years ago. I came to him and said what I had just done. He didn't condemn me. He was one of the first father figures I had, a black male. And he embraced me. He actually pointed me toward my first black woman therapist, and actually helped to point me towards some communities that could be supportive of my journey, because I realized all I had ever dealt with was racism. I hadn't even thought about sexism. It wasn't even a consideration, because I think if we're going to condemn black males or black boys, black men and black boys for being violent, then we should condemn the violence and the patriarchy of black male leadership that perpetuates this from generation to generation. It doesn't even set up a context for us to have any kind of real conversation that you're talking about around how we grow and heal as men.
All right. I will also share that link if you're interested in watching the whole interview. But I think that it was important to stop at the point where Kevin Powell talks about how we continue to patronize patriarchy, sexism, and racism together as one construct, as Bell calls it, the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, right? And she calls it that because, again, this interlocking system is supported and perpetuated by this mass passing down of this construct that we've come to know. And I have tons more to share, but I think that I may want to pause at this moment just for some thoughts and questions in the Q&A section. Just around my own context. And I feel empowered to kind of stop here and to share. When I began my journey in ministry, I have to say this, and I'm hesitating in what I share just because I want to be careful. But when I joined I grew up in the Black church. I'll say this. I grew up in the context of the Pentecostal Black church, but was educated at a Baptist seminary, but was familiar and connected to interfaith paradigms because I was also a part of a interfaith family who was both Muslim and Christian. And we coexisted together. And the kinds of arguments that people see around, Jesus and Muhammad, we just didn't have in our family. It wasn't the way, right? But I will say this, that when I got to the context where I believed that I was called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, I experienced tons of pushback, even after I received my MDiv degree. I received my MDiv degree, and I noticed that my comrades who had gone on after graduating at the exact same time as me received appointments to pulpits radically quickly. I noticed that my brothers in the journey were so excited at the end of the year that a church would bring them on, and that the women who went to seminary were only perceived as quality wives for these men, but not necessarily able to be contemporaries or to co-join in the space. And that the women in my seminary actually took on a position of either fighting to create their own space or fighting to be known as something others than a potential preacher's wife. And so as I went on in my journey through ministry, I noticed that in opportunities to preach, I was either being seen in the pulpit as a potential daughter, where I was dominated by the male pastor, or I was seen as a potential conquest in a sexual form. And I know that that's an expose and a commentary, a critical commentary from my perspective, but I think that the grappling with what it means to show up in communities often asks us to position ourselves of how we perceive others in our community as well. And Bell goes on in her criticism to talk about what it means to love well. We hold various positions in our community as sons and daughters, as friends and lovers, as whatever. However, her context of Black masculinity also challenges the notion for us to not sexualize or make parental the relationships that we come in contact with in this context. I think the criticism that Kevin Powell shares in partnership with Bell talks about how the combination of all of these things, these interlocking systems, create this space where we continue to believe that we're creating liberation efforts or affirming efforts, but we continue to perpetuate a cycle where we don't actually create a space where people can exist and belong outside of the context of how a system perceives us. And I know I said a lot, and there's a ton more. I have a whole PowerPoint presentation, but I also want to pause in this moment to stop and see if there's any reflections, questions, or comments to anything that I've shared. And then I'll share another 10 minutes of quotes from Bell that we can interact with, and then I'll close. So I'm going to just click over really quickly to the Q&A section. So it doesn't look like we have any questions at this moment. I'm going to wait for about 60 seconds to see if anybody's typing any, but please feel free to type anything here. And if not, I will shift back. Okay, so just skipping over a couple of things. So one of the things that Bell also says is to indoctrinate boys into the rules of patriarchy means that we force them to feel pain and to deny their feelings. What a confusing creation of anxiety. To feel something, but to deny it's there. That forces you in a space where you are literally masked and muzzled to express yourself. And she goes on to also say that some of the violence that we see, the outward violence from some of our Black boys in society, come from a position of them feeling this tug of war between having these harsh feelings that are internalized and no way of either expressing it or no way of identifying it, which is why in the season that we're advocating for therapy is probably one of the best things that we could do. And I will stop in this moment to say that if you are a lover of Black men, that you will encourage or be a Black male who advocates for therapy, because that is a way to normalize being able to express your pain and to identify what those feelings actually mean. So when it comes to love and hypersexuality, she said something very strong in this interview with Kevin Powell. She mentioned that Kevin Powell actually was seen as a womanizer because there was a spiritual void and his soul was broken. And she said that Black men fuck a lot because of deep soul pain. And the perception of the perception of hypersexuality is a primitive feeling and is deeply rooted to socialized practices of feeding dominance. And so men, have, what she's saying is that men have a lot of sex, but it's perceived as a primitive feeling, but it's really a socialized practice to feed their dominance or to feel like their Black maleness stands out. Think about it, right? Like I hear men say often that their masculinity has been defined by their female conquests. How many women they could say they've conquered, or how many sexual conquests, right? They could say that they've accepted. A male's maleness in certain cultures have not been defined, especially Black and brown cultures have not been defined as true maleness until what? He loses his virginity, right? But that has a lot to do with a collective soul pain around what it means to be a male in this society, and and that society has placed Black men in a fetish perspective, right? That a Black man is seen as sexy or sexual, but that's it. That he's not seen as an intellectual or a sole contributor to society, or a person who's capable of providing healing, right? Think about that for a minute. Think about the connection to hypersexuality when it comes to Black maleness. And I do see a question, so I'm going to pause here before I skip to the next slide. So someone said, I think this is great so far. The video made me think of having worked with men who had been incarcerated. We were working hard as therapists, but the director seemed to always be of the mind that not much will change with them. They will probably continue to be violent. It bothered me because there was no space for these men, predominantly men of color, to change or to be accepted regardless of their past. And I completely agree. I think a part of the healing work, Rian, is that we have to believe that there's an opportunity to heal. And I think, and I go back to the point around Black liberation. Those who are Black liberation scholars or those who are Black liberation activists do the work they do for hopefulness, right? They perceive that change is ahead. And when you step into a scene or a space to be a healer or to offer yourself as a therapist or a person who's there to console, you have to come with the mindset that there is change, with change in mind. If you start from a place of hopelessness, you're stepping into a black hole, a theoretical space where no change can be possible. You have to start with the end in mind, right? And if there's no end in mind, if your perception is that nothing will change, that they will continue to be violent, you'll never find a solution because you don't know what you're looking for. And I think a part of the challenge with being a healer to Black men or being a healer to Black ills in society is looking for the problem to create a solution, identifying the issues and being radically truthful about what it is that we see. I agree with you 1,000%. And so I'm going to skip over this last part around sexuality to the slide that says many women cannot hear male pain about love. Yes, many women cannot hear male pain about love because it sounds like an indictment of female failure. And this is so important. And this is a lot to unpack for me, but when we think about how women show up in society, we are naturally nurturers, right? We are created from this primitive connection to be nurturers. And so nurturing to a woman means that you give me something and I create, right? You give me a seed, I form a child, right? You give me this and I create that. And so for a woman, if we are given male pain and we don't know what to do with it, we feel like it's an indictment or a failure to our own existence to be able to grapple with. But sometimes just holding a space for conversation, just holding a truthful and honest sanctuary opportunity for a man to express his pain is enough, right? But as women, we often show up to spaces feeling like if I begin this journey with this person who expresses their pain and I can't heal it, that means that I fail as a woman. And we have to be honest about what that means to us, especially if we're women who are overachievers or women who look for the opportunity to provide a solution and we can't offer it. What does that mean, right? But that goes back to the notion of existing in community. Community is not always a space where lines look clean. Community is a space, again, which means that I belong to you and you belong to me. And together we can evolve into this creature. We don't know what it is, but community is also absent, of this means to dominate and to control. That means that we exist in this space to provide an opportunity to evolve and to shape who we become and how we create more community. And so the last two slides, and I'm just going to invite you to interact, and I'm going to stop here. Two questions I ask is, what does it mean to love well? Bell says to love is a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. To love well is the task in all meaningful relationships, not just romantic bonds. Knowing how to be solitary is the central art of loving. And I ask you, what does it mean to be solitary, right? What does it mean? In my mind, it means to be singularly focused on introspection, to knowing how I exist in a space, right? And to knowing that as I exist in space, what I give off, what I exude, what am I healing so that I can heal others? I talk a lot about in my work, the Johari window. And if you know anything about the Johari window, it's the 4 facets of being known, right? And the 4 facets of being known talks about the you that I know, right? Or the me that you know that no one else knows, the me that you know that only I know, the me that you don't know that only God knows, and then the me that only God knows that I don't know. I know I said a lot, but look it up. It's called the Johari window. And I know you're like, what does this have to do with Black masculinity? But Black masculinity is really not about what it sounds like, right? It's about inviting yourself to ask the question of how to deconstruct internalized patriarchal sexism and systems that make gender dominant. Patriarchy is not about a gender patriarchal dominance, but it's about how we internalize systems of control and how our systems of control cause us to not show up how we're fully known. And in advocacy for Black maleness, right? We'll hear from our Black male panel next week about what it means to be a Black man in interaction with Bell Hooks' work. But I invite us to ask ourselves these questions to become activists and agents for ourselves. How do I perceive women? How do I perceive men? What do I expect from women? What do I expect from men? How do I perceive myself as a man or a woman or a non-binary person? Where do my self-perceptions around gender come from? And so this asks the question of deconstructing how we see dominance and our position of dominance. And this will give us access to whole compassion and empathy and the preciousness that Bell suggests offers healing to our communities, to allow Black men to both be known as vulnerable victims, but also to embrace and to be truthful about the privilege that men hold in society and that Black men hold in society when it comes to interacting with others and even how they return or reverse patriarchal norms. So I know I said a lot, but I hope this gave you a caption into Bell's work. And I hope that you continue to explore her scholarship. And again, I will share the links with Dr. Tashina so that she can send those out to all of you if you are interested. Again, I thank you so much for joining me in this space. And I will take a question or two. I do think it's a little bit more time to take 1 or 2 questions. And if there are no questions, I will actually stop there. All right, so I don't see any questions popping up. So I'm gonna stop and just say thank you again for the opportunity to share content with you around Bell Hooks. And I do believe that it was enlightening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Tiara, thank you so much for sharing this awesome presentation on Bell Hooks and her work. I know oftentimes, many of us may not have never heard of Bell Hooks, which is why we wanted to pay homage to her for Black History Month. And so this may be the first time many of our viewers heard of her and her work and her views on Black masculinity or masculinity in general. So for those of you still watching, if you have any reflections or questions or thoughts, please feel free to place it in the Q&A box so that we can have a conversation to either answer your question if you have an inquiry. In the meantime, as we wait, I just wanted to let you all know that evaluations for today's webinar will be sent to your email for you to complete so that we could hear from you and how you experienced today's webinar. I'm thankful to have had Tiara present for us today, and we will be having another webinar next Thursday on what does it mean to be a man, a Black male, presented by we have four men who will be panel speakers, and Tiara will be our moderator. So be sure to register for that webinar on February the 10th. And then we have another webinar on February 17th. So please feel free to check out our website. I'll put the link in the chat for you to register for that webinar as well. If you don't have any other questions or thoughts, I'm going to share this information with you quickly. And so I just placed our website there so you can register for the other webinars, and you'll be receiving an email also speaking to the upcoming webinars next week and the third week of February. So if there isn't any other questions or thoughts or reflections, I thank you all for attending. Again, Tiara, thank you so much for your presentation today. I know I've learned a lot and some things that I didn't know about bell hooks. And so thank you for your time, and thank you for your sharing. I wish you all to have a great rest of your day, and see you next week.